I've not seen her picture before. I'll be sitting here waiting for the...
I'm leaving, Daniel. I came here to be with you, but I want answers.
I'm thinking this is unsettled.
He is lying to me, and he's trying to make me look insane. I'm getting sick to my stomach. It's making me question more about this woman. What is he hiding about it that he has to lie about?
Yes, to be honest with you, I am being caught. I didn't want to hurt her, but I was trying to date an American woman.
Daniel gets caught in a lie almost instantly, and the reason this moment lands so hard is because it does not feel like one small relationship misunderstanding. It feels like the first time the mask slips badly enough that even Lisa cannot talk herself out of what she is seeing, because the second she brings up the other American woman, the whole sweet and loving version of Daniel starts collapsing right in front of her, and what makes it worse is not just the accusation itself, it is how fast he switches from caring boyfriend to a man acting like basic facts suddenly disappeared from his memory. That is what turns this from awkward tension into real suspicion. Because Lisa is not just hearing something she does not like, she is watching a man who is acting open and calm suddenly retreat into denial. And that kind of shift always says more than the words themselves. Because if Daniel had nothing to hide, this conversation should have been uncomfortable but simple. Yet instead, it becomes slippery, defensive, and weirdly aggressive in that quiet way people get when they are trying to survive a story instead of tell the truth. And that is why Lisa looks less offended then, physically shaken, because she can feel that something underneath this relationship is starting to move. And the smart part of this moment is that it does not come out of nowhere. Because Lisa was already emotionally off balance before this even happened, she was already sitting with the sting of how Daniel reacted to seeing her without the wig. She was already replaying his friends talking about how much she changed his life, and once those things sit in your head for even a few hours, a new lie does not feel separate. It starts connecting itself to everything else. And now the question is, no longer did Daniel talk to another woman, the question becomes, why does every uncomfortable detail in this relationship somehow point back to what Lisa can provide? That is where the scene gets stronger, because Lisa does not have the screenshots anymore, and Daniel jumps on that gap immediately, which tells you a lot about how his mind works under pressure, because he does not rush to clear things up, he rushes to make proof the issue, not truth. And those are two very different things, because an honest person usually tries to explain the situation, but a dishonest person often tries to win on a technicality, and Daniel starts acting like if the screenshots are gone, then the whole thing becomes imaginary, which only makes him look guiltier. Lisa can feel that too, and that is why her panic is bigger than this one conversation, because now she is trapped between instinct and investment, between what her gut is screaming and what her heart has already spent too much money, hope, and emotion trying to protect. And that is the real hook here, not just whether Daniel lied, but whether Lisa is finally at the point where the truth hurts more than the fantasy comforts her. Because once she reaches out to the other woman herself, this stops being Daniel's version against Lisa's fear and becomes something much more dangerous. A story that might finally start answering itself. Once the other woman answers back, this should have been the clean turning point. The moment where the fog clears and Daniel finally has nowhere left to run. Because now, Lisa is not just relying on memory, suspicion, or old warnings. She is getting live confirmation from someone outside the relationship. Someone with no real reason to protect him, and that is exactly why this part matters so much. Because when outside proof enters the room, honest people usually get smaller and more truthful. But Daniel does something else. He shifts. He recalculates. And that shift tells you the problem was never confusion. It was strategy. That is the pattern that starts making this story heavier. Because Daniel does not respond like a man caught in one awkward overlap from the past. He responds like a man who always intends to use the smallest possible confession necessary to calm the moment, which is very different. Because first he denies the woman completely. Then he leans on the missing screenshots. Then once that defense starts breaking down, only then does he move into apology mode. And that sequence is the real story, not just the lie itself, because it shows that truth is not his first option. Truth is what he reaches for only after every easier escape route starts closing. And that is where the audience starts feeling something darker than simple irritation, because now The issue is no longer whether Daniel talked to another woman. The issue is whether this is how he handles everything. Whether every hard conversation begins with denial, moves into technical arguments about proof, and ends with just enough softness to keep Lisa from fully leaving. Because if that is the pattern, then one woman is not the scandal. One woman is just the clue. And once you start looking at it that way, the earlier details stop feeling random too. His friends praising how much Lisa changed his life no longer sounds sweet. It sounds revealing. His reaction to her appearance no longer feels like one bad moment. It feels like part of a calculation Lisa was not ready to name. And the earlier warning from another American woman suddenly stops looking like background noise and starts looking like a flashing alarm Lisa kept trying to mute. But what makes this act stronger is that it also refuses to let Lisa off too easily. Because she is not just uncovering Daniel, she is also confronting the cost of what she already chose to ignore. And that is where the psychology gets sharper. Because when people have already invested money, hope, fantasy, and public commitment into someone, they do not always ask whether the truth is bad, they ask whether the truth is still survivable. And Lisa starts moving exactly in that direction, because the more evidence she gets, the more you can feel her trying to shrink the meaning of it. Not erase it completely, just cut it down to a size that still lets the relationship breathe. That is why this moment stays tense even after Daniel starts bending, because his change in tone does not bring peace. It raises a harder question, one that should sit in the viewer's head and keep pulling them forward. Because if Daniel only admits what he has to admit once he is trapped, then what exactly is Lisa winning here? An honest partner or a better version of damage control? And if she is already treating confession like proof of character, then she may be standing right in front of the truth and still negotiating with it, which makes the whole thing feel less like a breakup, waiting to happen, and more like a relationship teaching both people how much dishonesty it can absorb before it finally breaks. This is the point where the story stops being a simple case of liar versus victim and starts becoming much harder to sit with, because now the audience is no longer just tracking what Daniel did, they are also being forced to look at what Lisa is doing with the truth once it lands in front of her. And that is where the whole thing gets messy in a way that keeps people watching, because it creates the kind of tension that does not let anyone stay fully comfortable on one side for very long. On the surface, Lisa absolutely looks justified, because Daniel did lie, he did deny, he did change his story only after being cornered, and he clearly treated honesty like something to be rationed out only when the pressure became impossible to avoid. So, in that sense, her anger makes perfect sense, her suspicion makes sense, and even her emotional spiral makes sense, because she is finally seeing evidence that the relationship she has been defending may not be built on what she thought it was. But the problem is that the moment she starts separating her secrets from his secrets, the entire moral balance shifts, because now she is not only exposing Daniel, she is also protecting herself. That is why this section works so well psychologically, because Lisa starts building a hierarchy of lies where his lies are dangerous and current, while hers are complicated and understandable, and that distinction is doing a lot of work for her, because if she can keep believing that what he hid is worse than what she hid, then she can stay hurt without fully confronting how much she has also been operating through omission, and that is where the audience starts splitting hard. Because one group will say, Lisa is finally waking up and reacting like anyone would after being humiliated, while another group will look at the same scene and think she is only outraged now because Daniel's dishonest dishonesty threatens her position more than dishonesty itself. And that tension is what makes the relationship feel darker now. Because once Lisa starts talking like forgiveness is something that can be balanced out later, like his lie can be absorbed now, and her truth can be introduced later under the same emotional discount, the relationship starts sounding less like two people trying to rebuild trust and more like two people quietly negotiating how much dishonesty the connection can survive. And that is a much uglier truth, because it suggests that neither of them is really fighting for honesty in a clean way. They are fighting for a version of reality that keeps the arrangement intact long enough to serve what each of them still wants. Daniel's role in this is obvious enough, because he looks like someone whose loyalty is tied less to principles and more to outcomes. Someone who will apologize if apology works, soften if softness works, confess if confession becomes necessary, but never too early, never cleanly, never in a way that costs him more than he absolutely has to lose. And Lisa's role is more painful because it feels more human. Because she does not look like someone gleefully playing a game, she looks like someone trying to avoid the full emotional cost of admitting she may have ignored every warning sign, because the fantasy was already too expensive to abandon. So now the bigger question is not just whether Daniel is manipulative, because that part is getting clearer. The bigger question is whether Lisa is still capable of using the truth to leave, or whether she has already crossed into that dangerous place where truth only gets used to renegotiate the terms of staying. Because once a relationship starts running on leverage instead of trust, every apology sounds smaller, every excuse sounds more strategic, and even the moments that look calm start feeling fake, because the tension is no longer gone, it is just being reorganized into the next version of the same problem. What makes this part so frustrating, and honestly so believable, is that people always assume catching someone in a lie automatically creates clarity. Like exposure should lead straight to a breakup, straight to a clean decision, straight to somebody finally respecting themselves and walking out. But that is not how these situations usually work when emotion, fantasy, guilt, and future plans are all tangled together. Because sometimes getting caught does not end the relationship at all. Sometimes it just changes the negotiation, and that is exactly what starts happening here. Because once Daniel realizes full denial is no longer going to save him, he stops fighting the accusation head-on and starts doing something much more effective. He softens. That shift matters more than it first appears to. Because Daniel is not suddenly becoming honest in some brave or meaningful way, he is managing damage. And there is a difference between those two things that people in messy relationships often learn too late. Because once he sees that proof is closing in and Lisa is emotionally near the edge, he stops acting like a man defending facts and starts acting like a man protecting access. He gets gentler, more emotional, more reassuring. He starts reframing the lie as old history instead of present danger. And that move is incredibly important because it pulls the conversation away from pattern and pushes it toward comfort, away from what this says about who he is and toward what he can say right now to keep her from fully pulling back. And Lisa responds to that, but not in a way that should be mistaken for healing, because her calm does not feel like trust returning, it feels like calculation entering the room, and that is where this whole thing gets even more layered, because the audience can sense that she is not simply forgiving him because his explanation touched her heart or because his apology repaired anything real. She is also calming down because forgiveness suddenly has value to her too. Because the moment she starts thinking about her own hidden truth, this lie becomes more than something she survived. It becomes something she may want to use later as precedent, almost like she is mentally storing this moment away for the day she will need him to be just as flexible, just as understanding, just as willing to absorb a painful truth without ending everything. That is why the emotional energy here feels so unstable even when the voices get softer, because what looks like reconciliation is really just a different phase of bargaining, and the power dynamic gets weird in a way that makes the scenes stronger. Because yes, Lisa gains power by catching him and forcing him to admit more than he wanted, but Daniel regains some of that power by changing the emotional temperature, by making himself seem vulnerable, by turning reassurance into a tool. And the danger in that is obvious, because once a person learns they can survive exposure by becoming tender at the right moment, then every future crisis starts coming with the same possible script. So now the question hanging over everything is no longer just whether Daniel lied about another woman, because that part has already been dragged into the light. The bigger question is whether this relationship has already crossed into something much more corrosive, a place where dishonesty does not destroy the bond, it simply resets the terms. Because if Lisa is forgiving him partly to keep the relationship intact for reasons of her own, and Daniel is apologizing mainly to keep the future open, then neither one is really rebuilding trust. They are testing how much deception this connection can absorb and still keep moving. And that is why even this calmer moment does not feel safe. It feels like a pause before the next impact. Because the other woman may not be the biggest threat anymore. The real danger now is what happens when Lisa's hidden truth enters the same fragile arrangement she just decided to preserve. By the time this story reaches its ending, the real answer is not hard to see, just uncomfortable to accept. Because Daniel's lie was never too small to matter, it was big enough to shake the relationship, expose his pattern, and force Lisa to confront things she had been trying very hard not to. Confront, but it still was not enough to make her walk away. And that does not happen because the lie got fixed. It happens because this relationship is built in a way that keeps rewarding both of them for staying inside it even after trust is damaged, which is a much darker truth than a simple cheating scandal or one ugly argument. Because what survives here is not honesty, not security, not emotional safety, but usefulness. That is the part that gives the whole story its sad clarity. Because once you strip away the crying, the denial, the apology, and the temporary softness, what you are left with is not a couple who repaired something broken. You are left with two people who still see enough personal value in the arrangement to keep moving forward. Daniel still has reasons to stay because Lisa represents access, opportunity, and the kind of future he clearly does not want to lose easily. And Lisa still has reasons to stay because she wants this relationship to mean something bigger than humiliation. She wants to believe that all the warning signs did not lead her into a dead end, and she also wants room to reveal her own hidden truth without losing everything in a single blow. And once you see those motives side by side, the whole relationship starts looking less like romance under pressure and more like mutual denial with emotional language wrapped around it. That is why the final escalation is not loud. It is internal, because the audience starts realizing this was never just one test of trust that they either passed or failed. It was more like a preview of the system they are probably going to keep repeating. Daniel will lie, then adjust, then soften, then say just enough to calm the crisis once denial stops working. Lisa will react, then bargain, then search for a version of the truth she can live with, and both of them will continue as long as the exchange still feels worth the damage. And that is the real danger here. Not just that Daniel lied, but that the relationship already seems designed to absorb lies and keep functioning anyway. And that puts the threat to each of them in a sharper light, because for Lisa, the biggest danger is no longer just Daniel's dishonesty, it is her own ability to keep translating evidence into excuses, because every time she does that, she makes it easier for the next betrayal to stay. Survivable too, and for Daniel, the biggest threat is not exposure by itself, because he already showed he can survive exposure if the right apology and the right softness arrive at the right time. The real threat to him is the day this relationship stops offering enough benefit to justify the performance, because that is when convenience disappears and the whole thing may collapse under the weight of everything both of them delayed. So the final answer to the emotional question is brutal but clear. Lisa does not stay because Daniel earned back trust, and Daniel does not stay because honesty won. They stay because the lie is still functional, because the arrangement is still giving each of them something they are not ready to lose. And that is why this ending should not be played like reconciliation. It should land like warning. Because when a relationship survives not by facing the truth, but by lowering the price of dishonesty every time a new problem appears, it can keep going for a while, sometimes a long while. But it does not become healthier. It just becomes more practiced at hiding what it really is. And the hardest part is that the next real test is already sitting there waiting. Because now the other woman is no longer the biggest question hanging over them. Now the pressure shifts toward Lisa's own secret and whether the same flexibility she just offered Daniel will still feel fair when the truth comes from her side. And if his lie was not enough to end this relationship, then her truth may be the moment that finally answers the question they have both been avoiding from the start, whether they were ever building something honest at all, or whether this was always just two people negotiating survival while calling it love.